My name is Salah Al-Mukammal. I'm a member of the Monroeville Interfaith Ministerium, and part of our interfaith activity is having Ask the Clergy program. This is a monthly program that we used to have at Monroeville Public Library. And each time we have a different faith. And this month, it's scheduled to be about Judaism. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the closure of the library, we decided to do this program online. So our guest today is Rabbi Barbara Symons from Temple David. Good evening, Rabbi Barbara Symons. How are you today?
I am well, thank you.
Well, we're so glad to have you. We wish we can be together, but I think spiritually we're together. Virtually we're together. Usually what we do in those programs is we start by having the clergy talk about their faith for 30 minutes or so. So can you please tell us about Judaism?
Absolutely. So in terms of talking about Judaism, one of the things I shy away from a bit is calling it a faith. And the reason is because it's not limited to being just a faith, which obviously Islam isn't either. But Judaism is a people and lots of ethnicities and lots of skin colors and lots of languages and obviously religious components and rituals and so forth. So I don't want to give it short shrift by only calling it a faith. Obviously that was not a critique to you. But I think we use that word a lot in terms of the ministerium, right? And you and I probably are among the ones that sort of say,
that's part of the thing that I was reading. It's like Judaism is not a faith. It's the people who follow Judaism don't just take it out of faith, because there's also a different aspect of it than just religion. Yeah.
Absolutely, and that's really important. And also, what it isn't is a race, and I think that's important to bring up, because as much as Hitler tried to make it into a race, it isn't a race. And this sounds a little bit too quick an answer, but when asked why not, the answer is you can't convert to a race, right? You can convert to being a Jew. I don't know if that question will come up later, but it could be that we talk about it. So when we think about Judaism, it is about 4,000 years old. So we think of it as starting when God called to Abraham in Genesis 12 to go forth, to Lech Lecha in Hebrew. And from that came our people, right? First it was the patriarchs and matriarchs, and then it was into the tribes, which initially were Jacob's 12 sons and his daughter, though she didn't get to be a tribe. And then it connected into the land of Israel and burgeoned from there. So we think about a 4,000-year-old Judaism that has spanned the world, that has multiple languages. The most well-known, obviously, is Hebrew, because our sacred texts are in Hebrew, or in Aramaic, because Aramaic was the spoken language around the turn of the century. So it's the vernacular. You would save the holy tongue, as it's called, of Hebrew just for prayer and sacred text. And also Yiddish would be the next best known one, which is a combination of German and Hebrew and written in Hebrew letters, and Ladino, which is a combination of Spanish and Hebrew. And there are other dialects, but those are the ones best known. So many countries, so many languages, so much history that you and I were talking before, that if we had 4 hours, I wouldn't be able to cover this, and frankly wouldn't be enough of a scholar to cover all of that. But when we think about Judaism, typically we think of the pillars of Judaism. And so one of the ways that our sacred text calls with the pillars of Judaism are God, Torah, and Israel. So I thought I would just go through briefly each of those. So while we have different names for God, what's going to sound like the irony is the one that we use that some people actually won't even pronounce unless they're in prayer or sacred text, but I will. I'm liberal. I'm going to feel comfortable to do that, is Adonai. And so it is actually not written that way in our sacred text. We have lost the pronunciation of the letters of of God's name. And so in order to protect it and not accidentally take God's name in vain by mispronouncing it, we go with a substitute. In modern Hebrew, it's actually related to the word for sir, as in you're in a restaurant, you call the waiter, sir. It's actually related, so I sort of jokingly say the big sir, the ultimate sir, as it were. But there are many different names for God, traditionally actually seen as 72 different names for God, everything from rock to a word, Shekhinah, a sort of feminine presence of God, El, which is just a shortened form of Elohim, which is God we see as the universal God. So when the world is created in Genesis, it's by Elohim, the universal God. And then when we get to the particular covenant between God and the Jewish people, we use this name, Yud He Vav He. The fancy word for that is Tetragrammaton. It has 4 Hebrew letters. Probably sound somewhat familiar to you, but Yud He Vav He. We don't have the W sound in Hebrew, but it's some combination of those letters, which also, just to make it interesting, the consonants can be also vowels. So again, to protect God's name, we actually don't say it. And when it's on sacred text, or actually if it's written anywhere, we traditionally don't just throw it out either. We save it and then we bury it, is a tradition. For that matter, even a Torah scroll, which I'll get to later, but when it can't be used anymore, we bury it out of respect. So we think of God, we are monotheists. We believe only in one God. Like Muslims, we don't believe in making any kind of imagery around God, certainly, and even I think we're a little bit more flexible. It'd be a great conversation to have at some point between us about now we will have depictions of things like in I don't know, artwork and so forth, whether in the synagogue or in the home. Recognize that obviously we're not bowing down to it, but we our main statement of faith and monotheism is, "Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one." It's written in the book of Deuteronomy. It was written as a statement, but probably if one asked a Jew the most important prayer, they would say that. So it's interesting, it's shifted from a statement, a declaration, into a prayer. And we say it actually often. It's written within mezuzot, which are the small boxes. Usually I do show and tell, but the small boxes on our outdoor of our homes, and even within the doorways of our homes, along with the prayer that we should love God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all that we are. There are different translations for that, sometimes with all our might. And so we say that prayer not only during worship services, but some Jews will say it every morning as they wake up, every evening before they go to sleep. It's the last words that are said before one dies, if they are able. If not, someone says it on their behalf. So
is it the statement of faith kind of?
Yes, absolutely, right. So we used to call it the watchword of our faith until we realized that nobody understands what the word watchword means because we don't use it anymore. So yes, absolutely, statement of our faith. So I can never remember who said this, and I wish I could because I'd like to credit who said it, but one idea is that God speaks to us through text. We speak to God through prayer. So I'm going to go into prayer and then I'm going to go into text. But so our most important holiday is the Sabbath. So for us, and obviously it's weekly. So for us, the Sabbath starts at sundown on Friday night until sundown on Saturday. Usually there's a little cushion, a little before, a little after, just to make sure you got it all in there. And there is worship at the synagogue both Friday night and Saturday morning. In a more traditional synagogue, there would be afternoon as well and evening. There's a lovely ceremony that actually ends the Sabbath. It's very brief, but it takes some of the blessings we have at the beginning of the Sabbath and sort of parallels them at the end. So when we begin the Sabbath at home around the table, we start with giving tzedakah, very similar to your word, of course, right? I hate to use the word charity, but the reason I hate to use it is it it's a nice, warm, fuzzy word, and I love that, but we see it as a righteous obligation, which is what it translates as. So we start by doing that, and there's a real reason for doing that. That doesn't sound right, but there was a practical reason. So some Jews who don't work on the Sabbath include in work anything that actually in ancient days had to do with building and keeping the tabernacle and then the temple going. But one of those things, for example, is touching money, that you wouldn't be touching money, you want to engage in commerce. So they'd empty their pockets, and rather than just saving the money, they'd put it into a tzedakah box in order to help people, right? And so it had a sort of practical purpose, but even for some of us who might, like I'm, again, a liberal Jew, I will happily go to a museum on Saturday afternoon after services. I will happily go into the gift shop and get a glass of tea, a cup of tea, and spend money, right? But at the same time, I'll be wary of what I like. I don't respond to emails and things like that on the Sabbath, even though now we're online all the time because of Zoom services and things like that. So anyway, so we start with helping others, as it were, and I always talk about the most important part of the tzedakah box, and they can be in any form, of course, is the hole that you open up to get the money out, right? It's not about putting it, it's about getting it out to help other people. So anyway. Then we bless the Sabbath candles, and traditionally it's the woman of the home, though I believe in being egalitarian, so it doesn't have to be. We bless our children, and then traditionally the husband blesses the wife, though now we hope to be egalitarian, so it goes both ways. We have blessings over wine or grape juice to sanctify the day, and to remind us why we have the Sabbath, which is both because God rested on the seventh day of creation, and also because when we were slaves in Egypt, we didn't have rest, and we need to not only rest, but we need to let workers and animals rest. So all those come up in this prayer. And then we
have roots.
I'm sorry?
It's all have roots, like every action have roots in the history.
Everything does, yes. And then we bless the bread, which traditionally is 2 loaves of challah, which is a braided bread. And the braid is the idea of going in from the secular into the holy, but also the 2 loaves is a reminder that God provided 2 portions of manna in the desert, in the wilderness, so we didn't have to work on the Sabbath to collect it. So while that's a lot of detail given our limited time, the parallel on the other end is to again bless wine or grape juice, to bless fire, because now some people who haven't been using electricity for those 24 hours now can, and to bless spices. That order was actually wrong. It's the wine or grape juice, and then the spices, and then the fire, and then the distinctions between Sabbath and the rest of the week, and day and night, and all of those kinds of things. So it's actually very powerful. So we have a very full holiday schedule that some people might just realize of. Maybe Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, our high holy days, our Day of Atonement, which is Yom Kippur, and Hanukkah, because Hanukkah gets on the calendar and it's long and everyone thinks it's important. It actually isn't particularly important, but it is certainly very long. Passover is a major holiday, but also Shavuot, which means Festival of Weeks, which is 7 weeks after Passover starts, and Sukkot, which is a festival where we sort of reenact leaving Egypt by having booths that some Jews actually sleep in. I've never done that, but we do try to eat our meals in them, and the temple has one as well, so some people at home have them, but we have them too. And then we have other holidays that are both connected to Israel in terms of Independence Day and Memorial Day, in terms of a Holocaust Remembrance Day, in terms of remembering the destruction of the temple, in terms of some sort of more minor holidays of a New Year for trees, and of celebrating Purim, which celebrates the story from the Book of Esther. So we really have a full holiday cycle. So I'll use one holiday to get me into the next pillar, which is Torah. So at the end of this holiday called Sukkot, when we reenact leaving Egypt, as I just said, it ends with a holiday that was created by the rabbis, which means that after the Torah was codified around the year, I don't know, 300, give or take, before zero, there was still a lot of questions and development of Judaism. I mean, as there still is today. But the next sacred text to be written, it was first oral and then written, is the Talmud. There was a version from Jerusalem and another one from Babylonia, because the Jews were exiled by the Romans. And so Babylonia was became the center of learning. And so I lost my thought a little bit, sorry. So this idea of Simchat Torah is this holiday that was created by the rabbis, meaning of this period. And it just means rejoicing with the Torah. So we literally do that. We sing and dance with the Torah. We hold it up high. We finish reading the end, which means the end of Deuteronomy. Of course, the Torah is written only in Hebrew, no vowels, no trope signs, which is how it's chanted. And then we start again from Genesis. Well, if you think of a scroll that has two rollers, you can't easily do that. So either sometimes we unroll the entirety around our sanctuary, so you can get to the end and then you can get to the beginning, because otherwise it's wrapped in the middle, right? Or we have two different scrolls. We read from the end and we read from the beginning in a different scroll. But that's where sacred texts come from, right? That idea of God talks to us through text, which again, I love that quote. And so one of the things I think is important is to think about, so in Judaism, we don't have, I don't know what we want to call it. We don't have, what we do have is different movements. And so the more traditionalist Orthodox and the sort of in between, though that doesn't sound like a great way to say this, is conservative, where they are going to be considering themselves more bound by Jewish law, but being able to reinterpret it according to modernity. Liberal Judaism, Reform Judaism, like ours, is going to be more finding that balance in terms of Jewish law and modernity, and finding how to move forward through both of those. So I don't know how good that explanation was, but I'm limited in time. So I'm doing what I can. You can ask more questions later if you want. I'll put it back on you.
I'm writing notes so I can ask.
There you go. So one of the ideas is, what's the difference, right? And so one idea is, so that in the Torah, it says the 10 Commandments are given at Mount Sinai, but it also says other things are given at Mount Sinai. And so then the question is, well, wait a minute, sort of what was given at Mount Sinai, meaning if God spoke and Moses somehow wrote or chiseled or something like that, what was it? And there's great debate in Jewish community, always great debate. That's good for us. We like that. We call it wrestling, God wrestling sometimes, and so forth. The word Israel comes from that idea of wrestling with God from the Jacob story. And so depending on what you believe happened at Mount Sinai, I think largely determines how traditional you are in Judaism, right? So was it literally God spoke all of it, not even the Torah, but the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, which also includes the prophets and writings, or even beyond that, the Talmud as well, it would have links back to it? Is it more where most of my folks would probably believe that it was certainly inspired by God, but written by human beings, which explains some of the times when they're either two different creation stories, for example, or some wording seems to not quite be right, or it's repetitive, or whatever it might be. So that's a really interesting thing to delve into in terms of interpretation. But the entirety of the Jewish community, wherever you are on that spectrum, reads the same Torah portion every week. So we get through the entirety of the Torah from Genesis through Deuteronomy, from one Simchat Torah to the next. So the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, so it comes out to 54 weeks. Obviously, the Islamic calendar is a lunar. Also, we have a adjustment where 7 out of 19 cycles, we actually have a leap year, which adds a whole month because our holidays, some of them are agricultural. I didn't really go into that. But
seasonal, yeah.
Yeah, so you can't have an early harvest like Passover is traditionally, right? And there was a pilgrimage festival, as was Shavuot and Sukkot. You can't have that fall in August because it doesn't make any sense. So because the lunar year is shorter than the solar year, you have to do a sort of catch up every so often, right? So we lose. I'm well aware of your calendar because we also lose. I don't know if that's the right word, but 11 days difference, right? 354 versus 365, right? So we have a lot in common.
I think they say 300 years, it's 9 years. So like almost like it's every, so that's like,
Oh, that's
so, yeah.
That is interesting. So anyway, so we do read the Torah when a child becomes bar mitzvah. It's the first time that they read the Torah. So they are having the honor of being able to do that wrapped in a prayer shawl for the very first time. In our congregation, they can choose whether to do it. They don't have to, boys and girls equally, and they help lead the service and so forth. If we go to the next pillar, Israel. So we think of Israel in this case about the people Israel, meaning the Jewish people. So in our history, we've been called a lot of different things, right? So we've been called Israelites, or in the Bible we were called the children of Israel is one of our names, right? At times we were called Hebrews, right? Very early on when Abraham was doing this, but even early American communities was using the word Hebrews, like in the 1800s. So that was the way. Now we don't use that. Now we use Jews.
Israel is the other name for Jacob, peace be on him, right?
Exactly, right? Yeah. Yes, good job. Extra points for you. So right. So and that's that wrestling I mentioned, right? That he gets named Israel. And it's described as one who wrestles with God and prevails.
And then the Judaism is from Judah is like the third, or something.
Yeah, exactly. So this idea that going back to Jacob's 12 sons, and it's not exactly as clear as that because his grandsons become half tribes and whatever, but we'll just go with 12 from his sons and partially his grandchildren. And so, yes, Judah was the last surviving remnant of the 12 tribes, partially because of exile from Babylonia in 586 before zero. We call it BCE, before the Common Era, and again later in 70 CE, we call it Common Era, when Rome caused that exile that I talked about, caused many Jews to go to Babylonia, and the leaders well, they went all over, but the leaders went to establish these study institutes there. So when we call sacred text, though, we don't only limit it to that. We have other creative interpretations. We have codes of law, and it's always being developed anyway. The blessing for studying Torah ends with the words, and Torah in that broadest sense, to engage with words of Torah, which I think is great, right? It's engaging. It's not, it doesn't say follow, it doesn't say teach, it doesn't say study, it doesn't say learn, engage with, which seems to me just to be very sort of democratic, right? Everyone can engage with words of Torah, and it also should mean that nobody's left out, right? So I like that blessing. Anyway, going back to Israel. So it is about Jews, but at the same time, it is also within Judaism. It's the Jews who are living in Israel. So when we call Jews who live in Israel, the citizens of Israel, we call them Israelis. Like, you wouldn't call me an Israeli because I'm not a citizen of Israel. But Jews who live in Israel, who have accepted citizenship, are Israelis, right? And so when we think of the Jewish people, we think of it in that broader kind of language. And again, there's tremendous culture of just, if you look at a Jewish cookbook, just wonderful foods and histories from lots of lands. Jewish history has been hard, though, and so somewhat miraculous that we still exist, small as we are. But in terms of the lands that have not allowed us to stay in, and there's just so many. And so sometimes we've been invited into certain countries, and then at some point the winds have changed and have been forced to leave. The worst example would probably be the Inquisition, so in 1492, right, with Ferdinand and Isabella. And so the worst example, I should say, until we got to Hitler. But so it is amazing that this religion that at one point was based on these pilgrimage festivals and coming to Jerusalem and to the temple and so forth, so reformed itself in order to become a religion of time rather than place. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel talks about that being that our holidays and Shabbat in particular is a palace in time, is what allowed us to really be able to be anywhere and observe our celebrations and our life cycles and so forth. The only thing I would add is, in terms of these pillars, there's a different way of looking at this, which is Torah, worship, and acts of loving kindness. So I feel like I covered Torah and worship at least enough that you could ask questions if you choose. Acts of loving kindness, though, is important. I mentioned tzedakah, right? Usually when we think of acts of loving kindness, we can't skip Maimonides, who's a 12th century rabbi, who's actually a physician also. Oh, you have it. Hi, there's a connection for you, right? And physician to the Sultan, actually, I mean, right, very high up, right?
Philosopher.
He creates, well, he did a tremendous amount of writing and is a preeminent rabbi. But at the same time, this ladder of tzedakah, as we call it, is really important for us because it's helping us rise up as though literally you're climbing a ladder to forms of giving. So largely it's about giving enough, but also about protecting people's privacy. So giving in a way that they don't know who is given in a way that you don't know who you're giving to, right? So if I donate to the food bank and make it anonymous, nobody knows anything, right? But even if I don't make it anonymous, the people get it don't know it's from me, right? So this protection. But the highest rung, which is the key one, is to give somebody a skill or teaching them literacy or something like that, so they can be self-sufficient. So but it is an actual 8-step piece there of trying to get higher, as it were. So with this whole idea of, Judaism being focused on sacred text, and we think there's 613 commandments in the course of the Torah, from Genesis through Deuteronomy. We think that afterwards, when the rabbis created laws and still do, it's called halakha, which just means Jewish law. Literally it means the way, but we translate as Jewish law as opposed to commandment, that it's a structure for Jews, these are not my words, but I'm going to use them for the moment, to become better human beings and better Jews. So and in that order, right? So we are, again, commanded about righteous giving. It's not just what we feel we want to give, right? We're commanded about leaving the corners of our field for the poor and the widow and the orphan, and we, some of us might not have fields anymore, but so what does that mean, right? How do we help people in that way? So anyway, so with that, there's a semi-quick and in ways not so quick summary of Judaism, and I will let you ask me whatever you want.
Well, I will start with the last point, because I have one of my question was about the halakha, so the definition of it and like the sources of like the legal rulings that come in it, or like so you mentioned it a little bit, but if you can maybe expand it a little bit.
Right. So again, if it's written in the Torah as a thou shalt not, I always go Old English because people sort of connect with that. Yeah. Then it is commandment, meaning it comes from God. Again, however literally you take that, but it comes from God to the people. After the Hebrew Bible was codified, like I said, around 300 before zero, it was the rabbis who create Jewish law. So let me give a quick example that hopefully will be quick enough. I always like the one about kashrut, about keeping kosher. I don't know if that was one of your questions. But anyway, so because that would be similar to Islam, right? So in the Torah, there are some commandments about what you can and can't eat. And this is in a category called chok in Hebrew, which there are different words for the types of commandments are. This is one that is not exactly logical. Like, why can't you mix milk and meat? What's the difference, right? And so some of these are just because God said so commandments, as opposed to the ones for, civil society of obviously we shouldn't murder, right? Obviously we shouldn't, okay. So the commandment is, one of the main commandments is you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, meaning a baby goat in its mother's milk, right? So goat milk is much more common in the Middle East because cows need more to eat than what it provides, right? Okay. Right? Right. You and I know this.
I agree on that.
So then okay, that's good. And you have some commentary about it and maybe some questions and answers. Well, wait. Okay. So what if you boil the kid, the baby goat, to cook it, right, in a different goat's milk? Is that okay? What if you boil it in, you could find a cow, let's just say, and you cook it that way? How does that work, right? Okay. So then it becomes halakha, Jewish law, because the rabbis are the ones, we don't have this from the Torah. The rabbis are the ones who say, no dairy, no meat together at all, ever. In fact, rabbis say, separate dishes, separate pots and pans. This is where normally I'd be going in and showing, I'd take in my kitchen and show all these things, right? Okay. Different Tupperware, different silverware, different sponges. Don't put the same things in the dishwasher. Some people have 2 dishwashers. This is not me, but whatever. And so it becomes this whole big system, right? That's an example of how the Torah said this one thing, and while it says it, I think it says it twice. It's very brief. It doesn't explain anything. You get into lots of questions because what about chickens? So that's the big question. The question is, Rabbi, why can't we eat chicken parmesan? And the background question is because chickens don't produce milk, right? So what's the issue here, right? You can't. And the answer is, well, if you're going to keep kosher traditionally, no, you can't. And the reason is what's called miriat ayin, how it appears to the eye. And so it looks like you're eating meat and dairy. The irony is that you can have fish, fins and scales. It has to have fins and scales, so there's no shellfish and so on. Fish is in category called parv, which means it can be eaten either with dairy stuff or with meat. So I could have a tuna melt, right? That goes with dairy, and to me, that sort of looks like meat and milk, but somehow that's okay. I don't know. And yet I could also have fish. What's an example of fish? I don't know. I could have gefilte fish, if anyone knows what that is, before I eat my meat meal, and that's still okay, right? So it can go sort of either way. The other category of parv is anything that doesn't have dairy or meat in it. So vegetables and fruits, as well as breads that are just made without dairy or meat. Eggs can go either way. So anyway, so that's the example to use of the difference between commandment in Hebrew mitzvah versus halakha, Jewish law.
Well, that's it. Well, just from trying to apply it like in Islamic perspective is mandatory, recommended, neutral, disliked, forbidden. Is there a similar thing, or all the command are you have to follow all the command?
Right. So, again, if you're more traditional, they're all required, right? And they're developing. I mean, it's really interesting, right? So the story I heard was when Jews came to America and really started to settle in numbers and permanently in 1654. They came from Brazil, actually, and then up. They discovered Turkey, because it's native to here, obviously, right? And not to Brazil, but also not to Europe and whatever. And how do you know if a turkey's kosher, right? It's not mentioned in the Torah because they wouldn't have ever seen a turkey, right? They really wanted it to be kosher because there's a lot of meat on a turkey if you think about it. And in fact, the rabbis, looked at it, compared it to a chicken, and thought, yes, right, this is kosher. Part of it is it's herbivore, right? It doesn't eat other animals. If something eats other animals, obviously you can't eat it, because then it's like eating the animal that's forbidden, like for us pigs, like for you pigs. By the way, our mammals have to be like the chicken, or the turkey, have to have split hooves, like a cow, rather than like a horse that goes all the way around, and chew its cud, which is a digestive process, but it also means it's an herbivore. And so it's an ongoing development, but Orthodox Jews would say, yes, you follow all of them, right? Reform Jews are probably going to say, well, let's find the balance here for us of what works for us. So I wouldn't say we exactly have gradations. We do have some guilt involved, though, if that helps. But we don't.
That's always good.
Right. We don't have that exact system.
That's good. Now, I wanted to ask you what you brought the Jewish philosopher in the 12th century, Maimonides, because I was looking, and he have the Judaism principles. He summarized it to one of a convert. Is those still hold through the I think it was 12 or 13?
13 principles. Yeah. So again, it's going to have to do with how traditional one is in terms of if they believe the 13 principles of faith. For example, one is that you have to believe that, and I'm going to open myself up to whatever, but you have to believe that there is, as it were, life after death. There's an afterlife, right? Some Jews don't believe that, right? And so some Jews think, but you have to believe that, and other Jews say, well, I believe what I believe, right? And so, right. So yes and no. It is still relevant. It's still something we study, but at the same time, some Jews are going to differ with some of what he's written.
And his description of God is very close to the monotheistic description. So those are still holding through.
Absolutely. And those part, absolutely. When you get into some of the belief about other things, right, is where it gets a little, but yeah, absolutely, right. That's going to hold more so.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you, because, the Jewish history, and it's a lot of stories on hardship, and I remember you speaking in an event that was sponsored by Duquesne University about refugees. I remember you made very beautiful connection between the Judaism and helping the refugees. And there's a lot of Jewish organization that does that. Can you make that connection again?
Absolutely. So nobody wants to be a refugee, right? I mean, people might choose to be an immigrant, but they don't want to be a refugee. So our main story is that God took us out from Egypt, and we tell it all the time. We don't tell it just in our holidays, which we do tell it then, and even recreating that booth I talked about, and at the Passover Seder, retelling the story with symbolic foods and so forth. But we have it in, like I said, in that prayer over the wine or grape juice, where the reason we have the Sabbath is, one of the reasons is because we were slaves and we didn't get to rest, and now we need to rest, right, and so forth. And so 36 times it's written in the Torah that because we were slaves in Egypt, we should. Now, what we should changes, right? It's not the same thing every time, but that we should treat the stranger, and usually it's also with the orphan and the widow, but sometimes it's just the stranger, well, right? So whether it's well based on sort of what we'll call the court system, that wasn't the language used back then, right? Of course, or in terms of making sure they aren't treated different than other people, or that they are, have their basic needs met, and things like that comes through just over and over and over again. So what's called HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, is still in effect now. And frankly, there are not a lot of Jews who are immigrating to America, but it's still in force in order to help others who are trying to settle in. It obviously works with the government. We're not talking about people who aren't legally coming into the country, but it is trying to help them, and it is trying to help people who are seeking refugee status and so forth. And so that is absolutely still in place. And really, especially with the big bands of Jews coming from Eastern Europe because of pogroms, which are attacks by the locals, and also just other economic, lacking opportunity and all of that, but a lot of anti-Semitism. This agency, as well as others, like even the Jewish Community Center movement back then, helped Jews new to America to settle in. And so that was very important for us. Our big waves of immigration to America were in the 1800s, the 1880s and the early 1900s. And then to some extent after the Second World War, though obviously there weren't many survivors.
A lot of time, yeah. All right, good. Well, thanks for that. But remember, it was very beautifully said last time. The other question I have is, and I think you brought it a little bit, you talked about Jacob, Israel, and Christianity, there's focus about Jesus, peace upon him, Islam about Muhammad, peace upon him. Talk us, the most mentioned name in the Quran is Moses, peace upon him, his story. Tell us about Moses from Jewish perspective, as far as his role. Do you have to do things because he used to do, as far as mimic him, or like things he said, you say? Can you tell us about Moses, peace upon him?
So that's a great question. You get extra credit points for that too. I appreciate that. So if we think about the story as told through the Torah, Moses appears at the beginning of Exodus when there's a decree by that Pharaoh, not the Pharaoh who knew Joseph and had him be second in command, but there's a new Pharaoh. We don't know how much time has passed exactly, who doesn't know Joseph, meaning either he doesn't know about Joseph and what he did, or he just chooses not to remember what he did. But anyway, and seeing how numerous the Jews have become by then, he puts in this decree to kill all the male firstborn, all the males into the Nile, right? And so Moses's mother, not yet named, but Yocheved will be, and saves him, right? And so he grows up. Anyway, so we're introduced to him in the very beginning of Exodus, and he grows up in the palace, but he realizes who his people are. And so when he sees Egyptian taskmaster beating a Jewish slave, he attacks the taskmaster, he kills him. And when that's found out, he actually runs away. And so when he's in the wilderness, the burning bush episode happens, and God basically says, you're the one, right? And so it's interesting, right? If we just think about it sort of as whether you want to think about it as literature, or if you want to just think about it, in terms of who would be the best one to pick. Well, he knows how the whole system works because he grew up in Pharaoh's house, as it was, right? And he's the one to lead him out. So for the next 4 books of the Torah, he's the main character, right? He is leading the Israelites. At times he gets frustrated by them. At times he lifts them up. He is working, as it were, with his brother Aaron, who becomes the high priest. And they're, constructing the tabernacle, which is the moving sanctuary, and that's where sacrifices were offered and so forth, which obviously haven't been offered. Were offered in the first temple, then later in the second temple, and not since. It's interesting in terms of the virtue associated with Moses. It is humility. So it's interesting, right? Because you'd almost think that's not what you would expect to hear. Right? He's once described that way, and that's the one that really sticks in terms of, if you recall, he stuttered or something, right?
Yes.
That's to God, I don't want to go, I stutter, right? And so it's great stories about that, right? All of us have whatever our challenges are that we can come forward and we can sort of follow Moses' steps in that sense. But Judaism, again, is so strongly monotheistic that we don't do things that Moses did. In fact, the big story of telling about Passover in the Haggadah, which is the special prayer book used at the Passover Seder, traditionally, leaves Moses' name out because the rabbis didn't want to have him become the object of worship. So at the very end of Deuteronomy, when Moses is not allowed to enter into the land of Israel, though he's at a what do you call it, like on a mountain looking over it and seeing it, he's that close, right? He's not allowed to enter, and he dies, though he is still I don't know how to say it. He's still sort of sound mind and body in a certain sense, right? It's his time because it's a punishment for challenging God back at the what's called the waters of Meribah, when he's supposed to just talk to the rock and he hits the rock, whatever. I mean, that's great opportunity for study. But anyway, and it says that God buried him, right? Whatever that means. But the thought in Judaism is that it didn't become a place that people were going to go to worship the ground Moses walked on, not walked on in this case, but the ground where Moses was buried. So it's still making sure that God is God and Moses is the human leader. And while Moses went to Pharaoh to declare the 10 plagues, for example, it was God who was bringing the plagues. Moses wasn't bringing the plagues. And so there's a real clear differentiation with that. But we have a lot of dynamics in terms of the stories of a little bit of story of Moses and his wife, more so Moses actually and his father-in-law, which is interesting, Moses and his siblings, Moses and his nephews. So it really is very engaging in terms of here's this leader of our people, and we are really able to be present in a lot of aspects of his life.
Okay, that's good. Thanks for that. Yeah, it's a very interesting story. It's very interesting because there are a lot of times mentioned different point of view before. Now we go back to where we started. You kind of said that Judaism is not that religion, but religion is not the best word to describe it. And I think there's that almost like a family, since it's from same lineage and almost like a nation, if I may use that word, with different races, different skin colors, different languages. But there's that. How do you still cultivate that aspect, knowing that like Jewish people are from different places? They don't have. It's not a nation. Like you're within a nation. Every they're in Germany and in Sweden, Europe, and Middle East, and here there's Jewish people. How Jewish people still cultivate and nurture that nation sensation? You mentioned Israel. In the principle, but how do you do it on a regular basis? Yeah.
Well, so when we speak of Am Yisrael, the people Israel, or you could say the nation of Israel, right? And again, this is not about Israel, the modern state, right?
No, yes,
right. Israelis. It's about Jews. There is a lot that we hold in common, right? So our holiday cycle, our life cycle, our Torah reading cycle, right? We are all one in this. And at the same time, for our book discussion, it's actually tomorrow morning, there's a book about Sephardic Jewish girl whose family moved from, her family's from a lot of places, but largely from Turkey, and came to New York City, and actually she got polio when it talks to her story. But it intertwined this Sephardic Jewishness that I wasn't so familiar with, right? So it's still, some of it is a little exotic, right? It's to learn, but these are still my people, right? You have that connection with it. So the fact that we are rotating on the same kind of time and values and texts is what keeps us together as a people.
Yeah, and that's good. And maybe that will lead to my second question, is with all the unfortunately, the anti-Semitism and the hate that on the rise at times, and especially in Black Pittsburgh, we have the shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue. How is Jewish people dealing with this? How you, as a rabbi, keep the faith strong and keep people patience and to deal with such sometimes really horrendous actions?
It's really hard because there's irony. As much as all of us are staying home because that's the safest thing for everyone to do and not spread COVID to anyone else, and anti-Semitism is still on the rise. Maybe people aren't, putting up swastikas as much, but last year there was a large swastika at the skate park, right on Avers Creek, the road leading to Avers Creek, and so it's here, and it's scary, and now there's a lot of what's called Zoom bombing, where synagogues are really worried about online prayer, where somebody's going to come in and do sort of hateful things and so forth and so forth. So so a bunch of ways. I'm going to start not in the Jewish community, but actually beyond it. So as you know, I work really hard in the Interfaith Ministerium, and programs like this let us really learn about one another, right? What is Judaism really about, right? And what is Islam about, and what is Sikhism about, and right? And I also try to be available to gateway schools whenever they want me, or frankly any school district in our eastern suburbs. And I do go into the schools and I do some teaching. I try to be available to elected officials, and also to make sure that we're being as inclusive as possible, right? A lot of us came together to work hard to make sure that, since a prayer is being said at the council meetings, that we could all be included. And the best way to include prayer, which might sound ironic, but I think it's a perfect solution, is to have a moment of silence. Everybody pray the way that you want to pray. And so I do a lot of work that way. In terms of the Jewish community, I will say we are obviously quite resilient, which is fabulous.
Understatement.
And I try to be there for our folks. So if somebody is coming forward to me, I will always follow through, right? I'll always try to see what I can do about it. I'll also be protective as best I can. All synagogues, and I imagine frankly all houses of worship, but obviously mosques in particular, have multiple layers of security. So we have our eyes open. And at the same time, there's a rabbi named Emil Fackenheim who created what's called the 614th commandment. So again, in the Torah, right, from Genesis to Deuteronomy, the 613 commandments, so he calls it the 614th commandment, which is not to give Hitler a posthumous victory, which means that if we just sort of are so scared we stay home, not about a pandemic, right, that we're just gonna, oh gosh, no, we're not gonna do Jewish because we're afraid, or or we're just gonna not care, we're gonna just sort of walk away, and that's all right, and whatever. Then we've really lost our way, right? And so, and remember, the word for halakha, Jewish law, means way, literally. And so that is, I think, the response, right? To be active, proud Jews, right? To engage in conversation and teaching, to learn about others. You've come into the synagogue many times for various reasons. So one of the most powerful was when just the community showed up on October 28th, a year and a half ago. The next day, spontaneously, right, to say we're here with you. But you and your imam have come in also to teach my confirmation students. And the idea of that is, first of all, obviously, like you and I just did, we find a lot of similarities, right? And with similarities, I hope, comes respect and closeness and all of that. But also, I think that hopefully our kids, when they say, oh, right, you have this and we have this, that they actually feel proud about being a Jew, and how to enact being a Jew, right? And so I believe strongly in interfaith dialogue, where I'm not thinking, oh gosh, people are trying to convert us, which in our history this has happened many times and still does, but it's an opportunity for deepening, because the best way, of course, to learn is to teach, right? And so that's just a great opportunity. If our kids can teach you something about Judaism, they've deepened their own learning too.
Yeah. The best way to learn is to teach, I think. Yeah. And so another question I have a list with the link, probably 5 more minutes or so. We mentioned, I think, about food restrictions, I think I mentioned. How about the marriage? Is there any restriction as far as like a Jewish woman or a Jewish man who want to marry? Is there any restrictions of
so there are restrictions, again, depending on your movement, and within movements, depending on a rabbi's individual stance. So in Orthodoxy and conservative Judaism, rabbis are not allowed to perform an intermarriage between a Jew and a non-Jew. In Reform, we are allowed to, but Reform is a movement that has autonomy with a capital A. And so individual rabbis can choose it. Now, if the rabbi's position isn't in keeping with the congregation, they might go their separate ways, or they might come to a different way to deal with that. But it's dependent on whether it's within the movement or within an individual's choice.
In the Arabic language, essential to Islam is Judaism is learning to speak. The language of Torah. Is that Hebrew? Is that something that you encourage people to do? Is it essential to do, or people can manage without that much?
Well, like you, right? You pray in Arabic. We pray in Hebrew and English. In a more traditional synagogue, it would be all in Hebrew. The sermon might be in English. But so we do teach it. So religious school for us starts when kids are about 4. We hope they start that early anyway. And it goes through 10th grade. But we see Judaism believes in lifelong learning. So 10th grade, we have confirmation. It was actually based on Protestants, and the Reform movement adopted, and so did others after that. But the idea is not that you're done in 10th grade, right? So the idea is that you continue on. So yes, part of that education is around learning Hebrew, and the way they sort of demonstrate that is when they become bar bat mitzvah at age 13, that they will read from the Torah scroll and read the service, like I said before, but that's where they're using their Hebrew skills. We don't do much with spoken Hebrew in terms of daily Hebrew. We really focus on liturgy, because in America, they don't really need to say at the store, how much the oranges cost, right? So we always debate this, because we only have religious.
Yeah, we have the same.
Right. So we should get together on this debate. Yeah. We have religious school only on Sundays and Wednesdays, and so there's only so much time, and only 2 days a week for learning the language is really hard. So we focus on liturgy, but we hope that kids will continue on, and especially if they go to college, that they'll take college courses in Hebrew. We hope that they'll get to Israel and go on. There's a free 10-day trip for Jewish kids called Birthright Israel, and not just kids, right? They have to be, I think, 18 through. They keep upping it. So something like 30, 32. I'm not quite sure. Right. So there are things that we hope we're planting, and they're continuing with.
Okay. Good. I think I will ask the last question. I had one more, but I think I will skip for the time. I want to ask you if you can give us like a good name of a book or a website or other resources with somebody want to learn more about Judaism. What's the best way? Obviously, getting to you and asking more questions will be one of the best ways if they can.
And you're welcome to. So a couple of things come to mind. One is Jewish Literacy by Joseph Telushkin. And what I love about this book is it's a tremendously thick book. I don't necessarily love that part of it. But it's like this thick, but it covers sort of all of Judaism at an adult level, but each subsection is 1 to 2 pages. So it doesn't dumb it down, but it will break things apart, like the Sabbath, for example, and I'm not looking at it, so I'm thinking the Sabbath will be in subsections, so it's just easy to read. So when I teach adult b'nai mitzvah, adult bar and bat mitzvah, because sometimes people hadn't become bar and bat mitzvah, whether because for women it didn't used to happen, or because someone had converted so they didn't have the opportunity. That's a book that I've used. So that's one of my favorites. There are other books like the Jewish Book of Why. It's 2 volumes. And if someone wanted to contact me, I'm happy to give other suggestions. But Jewish literacy is absolutely one of my favorites. And as you know, one of the things we've done in the library, and we hope it opens soon, is suggest books for them to have on their shelves straight from the religious leaders, so that they can say, oh yeah, right, this was recommended by, right, and so forth. So we try to do that. So while I'm from the Reform movement, reformjudaism.org is one of my favorite websites, and I don't just have to say that. But the other one I really like is My Jewish Learning. I think it's .org, but it could be .com, I'm not sure. My Jewish Learning. And what it does is you can put into the search anything, and you'll have multiple articles, but it won't just say Reform Jews, right? It'll say, well, Reform Jews do this and Orthodox Jews do this, and whatever it might be, but it's written really easily. It's only a couple pages long for each article. And for that one, actually, you can, and for reformjudaism.org, but you can sign on. So once a week, something just lands in your inbox. So you don't have to go searching. But if you just want sort of a constant, here's some more stuff about Judaism, it'll just come in. And so those are among my favorite ones.
Yeah. I want to add one that I learned from is so great courses. They have the great world religions. They have one about Judaism. They have the CDs. You have
Right.
So you have book.
Right.
Also, that was very informative. So.
No, I agree, and I think that's in a sense more in depth also. So I was thinking about ones that if somebody's just sort of starting on this, let me learn a little bit. It's sort of an easier grab to look into. But yeah, absolutely, great courses.
Yeah, that's more like a college.
Exactly.
Well, appreciate your time. And
thank you.
Sea of information. I hope that people can watch it and enjoy it, and probably have to slow it down at times to kind of get all the information that's being mentioned there. But we thank you for your time, and appreciate what you do for the Monroeville community, for the Jewish community, and all for our interfaith, your role in the Monroeville Interfaith Ministerium. And I wish you the best, you and the community, and hopefully we'll see you soon, not just virtually, but physically we'll be close together again. So thank you again.
Well, thank you for your questions and for your research into your questions. And I always know that you and I have a special partnership when we, talk about Judaism and Islam with so many similarities. It's just so fascinating to me. It's
amazing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Have a good night. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and hope to see you on the different programs as we continue to do our Ask the Clergy. Hopefully we'll have it back in the Monroeville Library once it's open. Thank you. Have a good night.